Hillary. I appreciate you inviting me here tonight. I'm going to apologize in advance if you hear a screeching cat in the background. He's just going through a phase where he needs his mommy, and either that or he'll be walking across the screen at some point. Let me start a little bit about myself. I am a librarian, and one of the things I love to research more than anything is anything to deal with movies. And my family thinks I'm a little crazy because I also research murders and death and funerals and graves and all those. But I actually have discovered there's a word for that. And let me get my PowerPoint up here. We can start, and you guys will be relegated to the corner.
Doesn't sound like a football game. I can't get the sound to work.
Or are you having a problem? Do you want me to hold off? Let's see. Get back.
I'll figure it out with her.
Okay. I can hold
you
off?
You can get going. Nope.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
All right. And let me go back to share. All right. Yeah, there we go. There we go. All right. So anyway, as I said, I love studying funerals, monuments, epitaphs, and I have discovered there is a word, and this is your word of the day, taphophilia, an interest or fondness in cemeteries, funerals, gravestones, etc. And like I said, as a fan of film, I was particularly interested about funerals of celebrities. So tonight we're going to talk about a few of those. So let's start by looking at the funerals themselves. The first big celebrity funeral was Valentino in 1926. He died in New York at age 31 of a perforated ulcer. And I don't know if you can see this. Let me try to get rid of, whoopsie, getting things in my way here. But this is the crowd here outside of Frank Campbell Funeral Homes in New York. And there were over 100,000 people that wanted to pay their respects. And as you can see in this New York Times article, they actually cut short the amount of time that people were allowed in just to get rid of some of this backlash. And reportedly, some women committed suicide over his death. And then he had a second funeral in Los Angeles, and they got about the same numbers. Now, the question came up is, where were they going to bury him? Obviously, they wanted to bury him in California, but the mayor of Castellaneta, where he was born in Italy, wanted his body moved over there. But the problem was, he was actually broke when he died. So June Mathis, who was a screenwriter, and she's credited as giving him his big break by casting him in Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, actually volunteered her crypt at Hollywood Memorial Cemetery, which is now Hollywood Forever Cemetery, as sort of a temporary resting place, because there was talk about building a monument for him. And this is actually a design of what that monument would look like. You can see the large columns. He would be on a rearing horse. They estimated it would cost about $10,000, and in 2020 dollars, that's about $146,000. And they started a Valentino Memorial Fund, kind of like an early version of GoFundMe, and started raising money from all his fan clubs internationally. And within maybe 6-8 months, they had raised $2,500. But the problem was, June Mathis died, and she needed her spot. So her husband, who was cinematographer Silviano Balboni, said, I'll give up mine, and we can move Valentino over one, and June can have her regular spot. So the money that was going to go to the memorial actually went to moving the body and doing all the things they need to do. And he ended up moving back to Italy, so he didn't need the spot. And Valentino also, every year on the anniversary of his death, a lady in black would appear at Hollywood Memorial Cemetery and place a single red rose on his crypt. Now, some people think it was a publicity stunt. Some people think, a lot of people took credit for being the Lady in Black. But there's one woman, it actually sounds like a possible argument, and that was Deetra Flame, who was from Ontario, California. And when she was 14, she was in the hospital, and I'm not sure what the connection was, but her mother got Valentino to visit her in the hospital, and he brought her a single red rose. And he convinced her that you're not going to die, you're going to live for a very long time, but if I die before you, promise you will come and visit me because I don't want to be alone. So she claims to have visited his grave for the next 30 years. And the only reason she stopped was because there were a lot of imitators stopping by to get the publicity. But when she died, she had a home completely filled with Valentino memorabilia. So that's why there's a little bit more reason to believe that she was a Lady in Black. But celebrity funerals have always garnered a lot of attention. So let's look at a couple others. Elvis Presley, obviously in 1977, there were over 80,000 fans went to the public viewing at Graceland, his home. And there was only room in the church for 200 people. So those were only invited guests. But all 80,000 lined the streets of Memphis. It was a 4-mile drive from Graceland to the cemetery. And you can see all the flowers there. There were over 3,100 floral arrangements sent for the funeral. And they made arrangements. They said, if you line up the next day, we will give you flowers from these arrangements that you can keep as a keepsake. And they had thousands of people lined up at 4 a.m. the next morning. So he was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery next to his mother, Gladys. But there was actually, unfortunately, an attempt to steal his body. So that's why it was moved to Graceland in October of '77. And on the right there is a picture of his grave at Graceland. But if you know your Elvis history, his middle name is spelled incorrectly. It's Aaron, A-A-R-O-N, and he only spelled it with one A. Now, I have a friend of mine who seriously believes that Elvis is still alive, and she believes that because it's misspelled, that proves he's alive. I'm just saying. Selena Quintanilla, the Tejano singer, when she was murdered in 1995, she had over 60,000 fans lined up for over 2 miles to get into the Bayfront Plaza Convention Center in Corpus Christi, where she was lying in state. Then, of course, there was Michael Jackson in 2009. His funeral was held at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, which can hold up to 21,000 people. But they had a lot of invited guests. So they actually put an online lottery for 17,500 free tickets. And they had over 1.2 million hits in the first 24 hours. And it was broadcast live to 2.5 billion viewers, which is equivalent to the number of people who viewed Princess Diana's funeral in 1997. The cost of his funeral was over $1 million. But the city of Los Angeles had an additional $1.4 million that they had to spend for police, trash pickup, sanitation, traffic control. Because it was at the Staples Center, they had to block traffic on the express and the freeways going through and other streets so that nobody would come through. And they had as many police out on the streets as they did for the 1984 Olympics. His casket that you see there is solid bronze, plated with 14-karat gold. And that cost about $25,000. And it's the same casket that James Brown had in 2006 and Aretha Franklin would have in 2018. So obviously for celebrities, fashion is very important. So I thought we would look at what celebrities chose to be buried in. So George Reeves, who played Superman in the 1950s, was actually buried in his Clark Kent suit. I'm not sure why that particular choice, but he looked pretty good in it, so I'm not going to complain. Marilyn Monroe had this green Pucci dress that she wore at a press conference in Mexico City in 1962, and supposedly that was her favorite dress, along with a Pucci scarf that she had. And a couple of years before her death, she had talked to her makeup artist, Alan Snyder. And she said, you know, if her time ever came, and she was just joking about this, she wanted him to do her makeup. And even gave him, I don't know if you can see it in that right-hand corner, she gave him a gold money clip that was engraved, "Whitney dear, while I'm still warm, Marilyn." And even her longtime hairstylist prepared her hair that day, arranging it as she would have been in her last picture, Something's Gotta Give. Now, people will say that Bela Lugosi was buried in his Dracula outfit, and he was dressed in a Dracula outfit. The actual cape is something he kept, and he was buried in a lighter version that he used for personal appearances. He wanted his cape to go to his son, Bela Lugosi Jr., and he gave it to his wife Lillian to hold for his son. And in 2011, the son put the cape up for auction at a celebrity auction, and the pre-sale estimate was anywhere between $1.5 and $2 million, and the starting price was $1.2 million. Unfortunately, the cape didn't sell at all. And part of the problem was that same auction was, they had a pair of ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz, which was also going to be their big money winner. So, as far as I know, he still has the cape. Frankie Thomas was a child star in the 30s and 40s. I don't know if you recognize him if you watch enough old movies like I do. But in the 50s, he was on TV in a series called Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. And he actually chose to be buried in his Tom Corbett costume. Tony Curtis decided to go for a more casual look, and that was white shorts and a favorite white sweater that had been mended many, many times over the years, an Armani scarf, and his favorite Stetson tucked under his arm. Michael Jackson had probably the most elaborate burial outfit that I've ever seen. The pearl that's a jacket encrusted with pearls that he wore at the 1994 Emmys. Now, this is not actually the jacket. It's a copy of that jacket. And paired with that, he had black Levi's with black beads, a 14-karat gold belt with semi-precious stones, his typical sunglasses, and then lucite shin guards. Now, this is the outfit he was supposed to be wearing in the opening number of his This Is It tour, which he was rehearsing for when he died. The whole outfit cost $35,000. But the interesting thing is, the one thing that was not included that he wanted was his single glove. The family chose not to bury that with him. Their own reasons. Now, Aretha Franklin probably had the most elaborate, because she laid in state for 3 days and she had 3 outfit changes. The first day she was in a red dress with red Christian Louboutin heels. The next day a powder blue dress with silver shoes. And then finally, and the outfit she's actually buried in, is a floor-length rose gold gown with gold sequin Louboutins. So one of the other things I was always fascinated about is celebrity last requests. Elizabeth Taylor wanted to be fashionably late to her own funeral, so her casket arrived 15 minutes late. Carrie Fisher longtime mental health advocate, openly discussed her battles with depression and bipolar disorder, had, as a joke in her house, a giant Prozac pill. And she told her family that if anything happened to her, she wanted her ashes buried in that Prozac pill. And you can see a picture of her brother Todd holding the pill. And unfortunately, you may know, her mother, Debbie Reynolds, died the day after Carrie died. So actually, some of her ashes were buried with her mother, and the two of them were actually buried next to each other. One of my favorites is Jaja Gabor. Now, she wanted to be cremated before her memorial service, and she wanted her urn to be carried into the church in a Louis Vuitton bag. And you can see in the picture her gold urn up here. And here's the Louis Vuitton bag. And it was carried in by her husband, Frederick Prinz von Anhalt. But if you look very closely at that Louis Vuitton bag, it's a pet carrier. And I'm not sure she actually requested that, or if that's the bag that fit the urn. Muppet creator Jim Henson actually had two memorial services, one in London, one in New York. And this was a man, if you can tell by the Muppets, who loved color. So his last request was that nobody come to the funeral wearing black. And he also had the Muppeteers sing a medley of his favorite Muppet tunes, including a heart-wrenching version of Being Green, sung by Big Bird. And both services ended with a Dixieland band playing When the Saints Go Marching In. The family of Star Trek actor James Doohan, who played Scotty, if you're up on your Star Trek, honored his request that a portion of his ashes be shot into space. There's a company called Celestis Memorial Space Flights that will actually do this. Now, it's literally just a little tiny bit of your ashes that will fly into space. Unfortunately, they tried twice, and both times the rockets failed to make orbit. So they contacted a different company, and as I say, the third time was the charm, and his ashes were actually shot into space. Luke Perry was an avid environmentalist, and he's buried on his family farm in Tennessee. And he requested to be buried in an infinity burial suit. And you can see the picture of it right here. Some people will call it a mushroom suit. It's actually a full body shroud made up of mushrooms and other microorganisms that will help decompose the body and then neutralize the toxins that will then help transfer the nutrients to all the surrounding plants. And just in case you're interested, a infinity burial suit costs about $1,500. Okay, Hunter S. Thompson, author and journalist, his funeral cost $3 million, and it was actually paid for by Johnny Depp, who played the lead in the 1998 film based on Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Now, Hunter Thompson loved explosions. So he arranged to have his ashes shot out of a cannon, and this is the cannon right here that he designed, with what they call the gonzo fist, and that's a two-thumbed fist clenching a peyote button. And this was actually the symbol for his 1970 campaign when he ran for sheriff in Pitkin County, Colorado. And attendees were also asked to pay their respects by enjoying the sound of ice clinking in a full glass of whiskey. Oh yes, and he had fireworks. Now, in archaeology and anthropology, there is actually a term called grave goods, which are the items that are buried along with the body. And this is a tradition that dates back to 12th or 11th millennium BC, but there are actually people who think it goes back a lot earlier than that. And celebrities had their own spin on what they wanted to be buried with. So actor-comedian George Burns wanted his toupee on, and his favorite blue suit, and his wedding ring and a wristwatch that had been given to him by his wife, Gracie Allen. But more importantly, he wanted 3 of his favorite cigars tucked into his coat pocket. And he was very specific about his cigars. He wanted one, they're called El Producto Queens. And he always felt that very expensive, tightly packed cigars have a tendency to go out. And he always had a lit cigar on stage. And according to Burns, if you have to stop your act to keep lighting your cigar, the audience goes out. Ernie Kovacs, who, like Burns, was always seen with a trademark cigar, was killed in an auto crash in 1962. And before he was buried, his widow, Edie Adams, put one cigar in his hand, and Jack Lemmon, who was one of his pallbearers, tucked another cigar into his pocket. All right, so if you know your movies, you might know that Humphrey Bogart met Lauren Bacall on the set of To Have and Have Not. And there's that famous line where she says, "You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve? You just put your lips together and blow." Well, when they were dating, Humphrey Bogart gave her a gold whistle charm. And after his death, she had the charm engraved, "If you want anything, just whistle," and tucked it into his urn before it was put into the columbarium. Frank Sinatra had a number of things, but most importantly, his bottle of Jack Daniels, which he always called the nectar of the gods, his Zippo lighter, a pack of Camel cigarettes, and $1 in dimes. Now, the dimes stems from the 1963 abduction of his son, Frank Sinatra Jr. And the kidnappers had demanded that all their communication be by public payphones. Remember, this is long before cell phones. And he was always concerned that he wouldn't have enough coins to make these calls. So even Frank Sinatra Jr. was returned home safely, everything was fine. But for the rest of his life, he always carried 10 dimes in his pocket. And then he also wanted to include his favorite snacks, which included cherry lifesavers and Tootsie Rolls. 3 days before Richard Burton passed away in 1984, he wrote a letter to his ex-wife, Elizabeth Taylor. She went to England for the funeral, and when she arrived home, his letter had arrived at her house. So she always kept that letter at her bedside, and it was her last wish to be buried with that letter. Harry Houdini also had letters, a packet of letters from his mother, Cecilia, and he wanted them to be used as a pillow for his head. And lest his wife get jealous, he included one letter from his wife. Also, his casket was a specifically designed solid bronze model with a hermetically sealed inner linings that he used in his underwater illusions. Composer Leonard Bernstein was buried with his baton, a score of Mahler's Fifth Symphony, which was his favorite. He loved Mahler of all the composers because, like himself, Mahler was both a composer and a conductor. And there are differing stories of whether he had the full score laid across his chest or just a pocket score that was tucked into the casket. But he also had a copy of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, because that was the book he took with him on all his travels. Tony Curtis, we already talked about him a little bit, in addition to being casually attired, had a travel bag filled with items also tucked into the casket, and that included photos and letters, a model of his car, his driving gloves, some cash, his Navy medals, a pair of his grandson's baby shoes, gold coins, 2 watches, a yarmulke from a Hungarian synagogue he helped to renovate, stones he had picked up on his travels, a DVD with clips from his favorite movies, his iPhone, sunglasses, 7 packets of Splenda, because he was known to put that on everything he ate, a Percocet tablet, sleep mask, his dog's ashes, and in case he wanted to do some artwork, paint brushes, paint, sketch pad, and a pen. Excuse me. Okay. Unfortunately, sometimes people think a celebrity was buried with something that they weren't. In 1958, Elizabeth Taylor's third husband, Michael Todd, was killed in a plane crash. And he's actually buried here in the Chicago area. He's at Beth Aaron Cemetery in Forest Park. And the story was that right before they closed the casket, Taylor put a 10-carat diamond ring in with the body. So in 1977, robbers tried to dig up the body to steal that ring, which was never there. And they think there was more than one because the headstone itself weighed about 400 pounds. The body was destroyed in this plane crash. So it was really basically a body bag was found nearby. And when they fixed the grave, so it looks pretty, but he's actually buried in an undisclosed location so that won't happen again. Now let's look at some of the unique markers and monuments that celebrities have. John Huston, writer-director, very proud Irishman, had his marker made from Connemara marble imported from Ireland. And you can kind of see that the stone has a little bit of a green cast to it. Louis Armstrong died in 1971. In 1973, they erected this special marker by his grave. And you can see this beautiful bronze reproduction of his trumpet and his signature handkerchief. Unfortunately, somebody stole it. So you can see at the bottom, it was replaced with a unremarkable version, not nearly as nice, but probably also far less tempting for people to steal. Jimmy Dean, and he's buried on his family estate in Virginia, chose to have a life-size granite piano as his marker. It cost about $350,000. And right over the keyboard is inscribed, "Here lies one hell of a man." Al Jolson has probably one of the largest monuments I have seen. And this is a large waterfall at the entrance to Hillside Memorial Park in Culver City, California. And it was just recently renovated. Sorry, not COVID, just stuck. At the top of that rotunda is, you can see he has his sarcophagus and a not quite life-size statue of himself. And inside the dome is this beautiful mosaic. And then inscribed around it, it says, "The Sweet Singer of Israel." Actor Will Geer, probably best known for playing Grandpa on The Waltons, was cremated. But he had this statue erected on the grounds of his estate in Topanga, California. Now, screenwriter Bob Leach is buried at Rose Hill Memorial Park in Whittier, California, and his crypt is actually back here. But I want to talk about this thing in front. In 1983, his stepdaughter, Marcely Nicholas, was murdered by an ex-boyfriend. And he and his wife became leading figures in the victims' rights movement because immediately after her funeral, he went to a store and there was the ex-boyfriend. Nobody had told the family that he was released on bail. So he fought very hard for a thing called Marsy's Law, which is in a lot of states, including Illinois, that requires that victims and or their families be told every time somebody is out on bail or whether their paroles are coming up. This piece here, it was actually built by volunteers on land donated by the cemetery, and it includes an interactive touchscreen and a digital theater which will display the biographies of hundreds of homicide victims. And on the right, in the memory of, and you can see Marceline Ann Nicholas is listed. Actor George Montgomery was cremated, and his ashes were actually divided in two. One part is buried at Forest Lawn in Cathedral City, California, and then the other part is buried at Highland Cemetery in Great Falls, Montana. And it's at Great Falls that he erected this full-size statue of himself. Director-producer Tony Scott, who is the younger brother of Ridley Scott, committed suicide in 2012, and his ashes are buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. And one side of his monument is a rock mountain climber, which was one of his favorite activities. But on the other side is a list of 17 of his biggest movies, including Top Gun, Crimson Tide, and Enemy of the State. So one thing I love about celebrities is they always want to give you their credits. Martha Raye started with Bob Hope, going overseas during World War II and entertaining the troops. But then she also continued with Hope and on her own during the Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict, sometimes staying up to 6 months. She was actually trained as a nurse, so she actually sometimes used her training to help soldiers. She was made an honorary member of the Special Forces, and President Jolson gave her her Green Beret and honorary title of Lieutenant Colonel. She was nicknamed Colonel Maggie by the troops, and in 1993 she received the Presidential War Medal of Freedom, which is the highest commendation for a civilian. And they actually made a special exception to policy so that she could be buried at the military cemetery at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And you can see by the marker, it says Martha Raye, civilian. And I think she's the only one that's ever had that. This monument is unique, but not because it's a pyramid, because pyramids have been used for centuries. But it's unusual because it's not currently occupied. This is at St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in New Orleans. And the cemetery was going into foreclosure. And the entire cemetery was purchased by actor Nicolas Cage. And he erected this monument to be his future gravesite. It's 9 feet tall, and it's engraved with Omni ab uno, which translates to everything from one. Okay, sometimes there's a marker for a celebrity, but in fact, it's actually not their place of burial. So again, another word for you today is a cenotaph. And a cenotaph is an empty tomb or a monument in honor of a person whose remains are elsewhere, but it can also be the initial resting place for somebody whose remains have been moved to a different location. So the first one is for, now the dog's name was actually Terry, but we all know her as Toto. Terry was a Cairn Terrier who was abandoned at Carl Spitz's Hollywood Dog Training School. And she made movies with Shirley Temple and had a good long career. She retired at the age of 12 and lived with the Spitz family as a pet. And when she died in 1945, they buried her on the family property. Now in 1958, they were making an expansion to the Ventura Freeway, which unfortunately went right through the Spitz property, and the entire area was destroyed, including Terry's grave. So in 2010, there was a campaign formed to provide Toto with a memorial stone, and this was dedicated in 2011 at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Jane Mansfield was born in Pennsylvania, and that's actually where she's buried. But the Jane Mansfield fan club felt she needed representation in Hollywood. So they actually paid to have a cenotaph erected at Hollywood Forever. Now I bring this up because you'll notice on her marker in Pennsylvania, says she was born in 1933. On her cenotaph, it says 1938. Now, I don't know if this was an honest mistake or they were making reference to the fact that she always provided incorrect information about her age. Band leader Glenn Miller died when his plane disappeared over the English Channel during World War II. The plane and his remains were never found, but this cenotaph was erected at the Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut. Actor-director Sam Wanamaker, as a performer, was annoyed that even though there are a number of Globe theaters around the US, the original site in London was only marked by a plaque, and the plaque was on a brewery. So he was instrumental in getting the new Globe Theater built. It's actually only about 1/8 of a mile from where the original one was. It was opened the new Globe opened in 1997. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1993, so he never got to see it to fruition. However, his ashes are buried under the stage of the new Globe. And this cenotaph, which is just says, to Sam, in Thanksgiving for Sam Wanamaker, whose vision rebuilt Shakespeare's Globe Theater. And that is in a church right next to the spot where the Globe was. And sometimes a cenotaph can right a horrible wrong. Hattie Mcdaniel, who we all know, was the first African-American to win an acting Oscar. And it was her wish to be buried at Hollywood Memorial Park. Unfortunately, the man who ran it denied her that opportunity. And he also ran the cemetery into bankruptcy, and we could do a whole nother presentation on him alone. But in 1999, the new owners discovered this in the records, and they approached McDaniel's family and said, we want to right this wrong, and we will pay whatever it takes to have that body moved. And they picked out a beautiful spot at Hollywood Forever. The family ultimately decided not to move her body, and she's buried at Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles. But they did put this cenotaph marker in its place. So she's at Hollywood Forever, where she wanted to be. Whenever I go through cemeteries, I always find it sad that you have names and you don't know anything about the person. But celebrities who always want recognition have come up with ways to offer clues to who they were. So there are those who will put their picture on it. So here we have Don Adams in a pose from his TV show Get Smart. Douglas Fairbanks has his profile carved into the monument. Don Knotts' marker shows him in all kinds of different roles from television and film. Hang Noor, who's actually only one of 2 non-actors to ever win an Academy Award for acting, is shown here holding his Best Supporting Actor Award for The Killing Fields. And some people will put a line that describes what their line of work was. So you have Lucille Bliss, who is not only a voice actress, but a voice actress extraordinaire. Alan Curtis just puts film pioneer, and he directed 278 films between 1913 and 1922. And Carl Dane just simply says he was an actor. Maui Gertzman, who was a director of cinematography, also proudly has the initials ASC after his name, which shows that he was a member of the American Society of Cinematographers. And I'm not sure you can make that out, but William Inge's stone marks that he was a playwright. And Edward Mann lists many of the positions he held during his time in Hollywood: director, writer, producer, cartoonist. Emery McCarger didn't have a long career in Hollywood, but he actually, when he says studio pioneer, he meant that. He was hired by D.W. Griffith. He was a cellist. And Griffith hired him to play mood music while they were filming to help the actors emote better during filming. And he was the first one to do this. And this actually became a practice later in silent films. Jimmy McHugh also notes that he was a composer. And Lou Penn simply says that he was a stuntman. Harry Ross was a well-respected Hollywood makeup artist in the 30s through the 60s. And R.D. McLean, it wasn't enough to tell people that he was an actor. He wanted to be known as a Shakespearean actor. But more than just listing their line of work, some celebrities want you to remember them for specific roles. So you may not know the name Matthew Beard, but you might remember him as Stymie from The Little Rascals. And Chuck Connors, who played the rifleman on TV, was also an athlete before he became an actor. And for Chicagoans, he played on the Cubs. He played 66 games in 1951. He also played for the LA Dodgers. And before going to baseball, he actually played professional basketball with the Boston Celtics right after he got out of the service in 1946. And he's actually the first professional basketball player to shatter the backboard, which he did in a warm-up in 1946. So there's a good beer bet for y'all. Alan Crossland lists one of his biggest accomplishments, and that was he was the director of the first talking picture, The Jazz Singer. Friz Freleng from Warner Brothers, an animator, created most of our favorite Looney Tunes. So you can see on his stone, he has the characters, and that from left to right, it's Tweety, Yosemite Sam, Sylvester the Cat, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, Elmer Fudd, and Speedy Gonzales. Now, you may not know the name Malia Nurmi, but you might recognize her for her role as Vampira, who was the television's first horror host. Lauren Green made sure to mention that he played Ben Cartwright on Bonanza. And Susanna Kim mentions that she played in the film The Good Earth. Now, Kim only made 5 films in Hollywood. And sadly, her role as the little fool is the only film that she actually got screen credit on. So I don't blame her for putting that up there. Al Lewis chose to put a picture of himself in one of his best known roles, and that was Grandpa in the TV series The Munsters, and even said Grandpa Al Lewis. Joe DeRita was the last person to play with this. He replaced eventually Curly Howard after a number of others. So he was the last one to work with Mo Howard and Larry Fine. So you might not know these names at all if they didn't put their signature role in. So William Laughlin, or Billy Laughlin, had that unique voice. So he was Froggy in the Our Gang series. And Elmo Lincoln was the first actor to play Tarzan, and that was in a 1918 silent film, Tarzan of the Apes, but he also played Tarzan in 3 more silent films. And would you know it's George Reeves if he didn't remind you that he played Superman? And some celebrities chose to be buried under their real name, but put their stage name so that you would remember who they were. So we have Helen Gould Beck, who was the fan dancer, Sally Rand, and again, Chicago history. She made quite a stir at the 1933 World's Fair. And Jack Sue is buried under his real name of Goro Suzuki. But sometimes it's a line of dialogue or a piece of music that's going to help you remember who these people were. So you have consummate voice actor Mel Blanc, who was known as the man of 1,000 voices. And you hear him at the end of every Looney Tune short saying, "That's all, folks." Jackie Gleason always ended his monologue on the Jackie Gleason show with, "And away we go." Character actor Howard Morris chose his line from his character Ernest T. Bass on the Andy Griffith Show. And sometimes it doesn't even have to be a line of dialogue. The hands on Leonard Nimoy's, and I don't know if you are up on your Star Trek history, but the symbol "live long and prosper" is actually derived from the blessing that the rabbi gives over the congregation. And the story Nimoy always told is that he was a kid, his grandfather took him to synagogue, and the congregation was supposed to be turned away from the rabbi while he gave the blessing, but he was a kid, so he turned around and he saw the two hands in the shin for Shaddai. And when he had to create something for Spock, he chose to use that symbol. So I think he intended the hands on his marker to be the blessing, but I dare say that 90% of the people who are visiting the grave will think of it as "live long and prosper." Musicians often will put a piece of music or lyrics to highlight their accomplishments. Here, Leo Diamond provides the first few bars of his biggest hit called "Offshore" in 1953. And I did check it. I checked it with the sheet music, and that's really the songs. Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet always performed the George and Ira Gershwin classic "Our Love Is Here to Stay" in their nightclub act. So here they put the lyrics from that. Lyricist Jerry Lieber with composer Michael Stoller wrote the song "Is That All There Is?" and in the 1960s, but it became a hit in '69 when Peggy Lee recorded it. And here he's using the second line of the verse, and that is, "If that's all there is, then let's keep dancing." And Sammy Lerner reminds visitors that he wrote the song "Popeye the Sailor Man." And in just case you're not familiar with that song, he actually has the image of Popeye with his can of spinach. Now with Dean Martin, it seemed a natural choice to put "Everybody Loves Somebody Sometime," which was his theme song. Frank Sinatra chose "The Best Is Yet to Come." Now, this song was actually not written for him. It was written for Tony Bennett, but he recorded it in 1964 on an album with Count Basie. And it also is the very last song that Frank Sinatra sang in public at his last concert in February 1995. Gene Vincent was a rock and roll star, and his biggest hit was "Bebop-A-Lua." And that's actually the first two bars of "Bebop-A-Lua." The only problem is there's a typo, if you can call something carved in stone a typo. And that is the fourth note after the clef. You'll see there's a B flat marking, but the note is a D, and it actually should be a B flat. Celebrities are always asked for their autographs, and in death, sometimes they provide their last autograph. And each of these has an example of their autograph, so you can see that they are really the same. So this is Sonny Bono. Not perfect, but you can kind of see how it's similar. Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash. And even producer David O. Selznick. He was the producer of Gone with the Wind. But one of the most elaborate signatures is that of Liberace, and his autograph is actually on the lower right, and it would have his signature and a drawing of a piano with his signature candelabra on there. And as you can see, on his marble sarcophagus is a reproduction of that signature. So we did call this talk Famous Last Words, so let's take a look at some of the things celebrities have written on their graves. Now, W.C. Fields, in a 1925 interview, said he wanted his epitaph to read, "I would rather be living in Philadelphia." And this comes from a long-standing jokes that he would make about being born in Philadelphia. Some people will say, one comment was, "On the whole, I'd rather be in Philadelphia." But as you can see on his grave marker, there is nothing. Some actors can't help but be dramatic, even at the end. So here we have stage actor Alexander Carr. And he did make a couple silent films and a couple talkies. But instead of just saying he died, he took his last curtain call. Jan Murray, who was a popular comedian on the Borscht Belt circuit, and he was on the Tonight Show many times. You'll note that on his, instead of saying he was born in the Bronx and died in Beverly Hills, he opened and he closed. Now, Raymond Danis didn't make a lot of films. He was more of a stage actor. And he actually wrote this epitaph himself. He had spent 40 years with the Theater Palisades in Venice, California, actor, director, producer. And so he says, "The play is over, lights up, curtain call, applause, bow. The curtain closes as the lights fade, the end." But there was actually a last line that was not included, and that was, "Goodbye, world. It's been nice being here." Some actors like to have a little fun on their grave markers. Billy Barty, who suffered from hypoplasia dwarfism, had a huge career. His career spanned from 1927 to 2000, so that's 73 years. And so his marker says, "In loving memory of Billy Barty, who always thought big." Benny Rubin began in vaudeville before working in film and television. And in vaudeville, playing the Palace was the pinnacle of success. So you can see now that he's playing the big time in heaven. Rodney Dangerfield's epitaph actually grew out of a joke from his early comedy routines. And you know, he would always say, "I get no respect." It was, "I get no respect. I bought a cemetery plot. The guy said, there goes the neighborhood." Merv Griffin had a very popular talk show from 1965 to 1986 and would always say, "We'll be right back after these messages." So now he reminds us he won't be back. Actress Joan Hackett became known almost as much for her stubbornness as for her acting. She was known to drive directors crazy with her demands. And one of her demands was that she needed a full 10 to 12 hours of sleep in order to perform at her best. And while she was resting, she did not want to be disturbed, so she would put a note on her door that said, "Go away, I'm asleep." Jack Lemmon was a self-confessed taphophile. And wherever he went, he would always put cemeteries on his travel itineraries. And somebody asked him what his epitaph might be, and he told them how he collected them. He says, "I'm finally putting my archive of interesting tombstones to good use." Leslie Nielsen was known to love gags about gas, flatulence, and whoopee cushions. And he said in a 1996 interview that he wanted his epitaph to be "Let her rip." And it was. And then nearby his grave is a bench under a shade tree, and that includes another quote from Leslie Nielsen that says, "Sit down whenever you can." Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with Billy Wilder's film, Some Like It Hot. He wrote it and he directed it, and of course the last line is from Joey Brown, who plays Osgood Fielding, and it says, "Well, nobody's perfect." So he decided to incorporate that into his tombstone. But celebrities do like to get serious at times too. So we have Bette Davis, who often fought against the studio system and was one of the first actresses to actually sue the studio for the right to choose her own roles and have control over the roles she played. She was once quoted as saying, "I survived because I was tougher than anybody else." and her marble sarcophagus is inscribed, "She did it the hard way." John Wayne actually wanted his tombstone to read "Feo, suerte y formal," which translates to ugly, strong, and dignified. But his family actually chose this quote, which was from an interview he gave in 1971, and that says, "Tomorrow is the most important thing in life, comes into us at midnight very clean. It's perfect when it arrives, and it puts itself in our hands. It hopes we've learned something from yesterday." And then, of course, the image of Monument Valley, which played such a significant role in a lot of his Westerns. But one of my favorite stories is George Burns and Gracie Allen. And they were always billed as George Burns and Gracie Allen, when they were in vaudeville, on stage, in film, and in television. And when Gracie died in 1964, Burns insisted that her casket be placed on the left, so that when he died, she would forever have first billing. And then, of course, Ed Wynn, very simply, "Dear God, thanks." And on that note, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to stick around.
That was really very interesting and informative, Susan.
Thanks.
There are a couple of questions. Was Louis Armstrong buried as a Jewish person, or was he?
There's no markings on his stone. He is buried in Flushing, Queens. So I'm not sure.
I mean, how did you find all of this information about all of these different people? I mean, what's the process?
I do way too much research.
So someone dies and...
There are websites totally devoted to these, and one, and please don't tell them they stole a lot of images from them. That's slightly illegal, but I'm not publishing them, so that's okay. There is a website called Find a Grave. And it's findagrave.com. And it's not, you can't just say actor or whatever, but I had a list of all the cemeteries in the Los Angeles area, which there are a lot. And you can literally see every grave. Not every single grave is in there, but there are people who go out and help them get information by taking pictures, etc. And they will mark it with a famous grave, so that you can at least look at those. And I went through, and most of them were boring, but every time I saw one that had either an interesting illustration or epitaph, I put it into a file. So I mean, I have about 12 times as much as what I showed you guys tonight.
Wow.
Like I said,
Fantastic.
I just have way too much time. And then, as a researcher, the more I find, the more I get into it.
So, you said this celebrity or that celebrity wanted this on their headstone, that on their headstone. Was it really the celebrity, or is it their family, or is it a mix of both? Like they've left these instructions.
It's a mix. Obviously Leslie Nielsen, yeah, he specifically said that. Jack Lemmon and Billy Wilder, yes. Others, I think it was their family. Certainly John Wayne's family went against his wishes and put something else on, although that's a marvelous quote. I love that. So, I mean, there's no way to confirm. I know Frank Sinatra, that was also his family who chose that.
Is there any celebrity that you haven't found information on that you really would like to include, or?
Not that I can think of, because I found so many, but I'm sure I will come across one that you go, oh, forgot about them. I know even like I didn't know initially about the Michael Todd grave robbing. A colleague of mine brought that up to me because he lived in Forest Park and remembered that being written up in the papers.
Do you ever visit the cemeteries and do rubbings of the stones?
Yes and no. when I was an art student, we used to go to cemeteries to do rubbings. So yeah, I've done that. And because I have stolen the images from Find a Grave, I actually went out to Los Angeles a couple years ago with the intent of taking these pictures myself so that I could say, I own the rights to these pictures. But I went to Hillside where Al Jolson is buried. And like I said, that's right at the front when you walk in. And you realize how massive these cemeteries are. And it literally would take me months to go through one cemetery. And I remember calling my sister, who's an intellectual property attorney, and I'm like, I can't do this. I spent all this money to come out here and I can't do this. And she's like, okay. And she's the one who said, you're not publishing a book, steal away. So we can blame her. But sometimes, you know, I mean, and if you go, with the exception of the pet cemetery, they're really not nice about telling you where the graves are. But I had gone to the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery, where Valentino's dog is buried. Not that there's anything great about his grave, but I was also doing research on Hollywood ghost stories. And there's a famous ghost story involved in that. So, but they were really nice about telling me where that was.
Interesting. Well, I think those are all the questions we have. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really a very interesting program. We appreciate it. I think we learned some things about celebrities, and now maybe we all need to think about what we're going to have put on our headstones.
If I can add one more,
Sure.
You know the tradition of putting a stone on the marker to show you have visited. Edie Gourmet, and hers is in a wall crypt. Instead of stones, her family have literally pasted rhinestone pins all over.
Interesting.
I thought, now that's the way to go.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Please visit jccchicago.org for the rest of the programming that we have coming up in September. Susan, thank you again. It really was very interesting, and we appreciate your time. Have a great night, everyone.
You too. Bye.